To talk about the big geopolitical trends that are likely to play out through 2023, I'm joined at the World Economic Forum here in Davos by one of the world's leading political scientists, one of the top experts on global political risks. Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group. Welcome to the India Today studio here in Davos. It's fantastic to have you with us. Thank you. I want to start by getting you to talk to our viewers. As far as the whole world is concerned, the big global trend that you think is number one in your mind when you look at global risks this year?
So the single thing that worries me the most in terms of global volatility is that we have a small number of individual actors, players, who have an extraordinary amount of power. They've surrounded themselves with yes men who just tell them what they want to hear. And there are no checks and balances on the decisions that they take internally. So this is not like an American president, Democrat, Republican. They do something you don't like, they get constrained by their actions. No, what am I talking about? I'm talking about some dictators like Vladimir Putin, like the Iranian supreme leader, and even like Xi Jinping in his third term, who has consolidated so much power. But I'm also talking about some of these tech bros like Mark Zuckerberg and like Elon Musk, who also, are doing far more that have dramatic implications on democracies around the world, and their institutions just do what they want. Nobody stops them. We've never had a world with so many powerful rogue actors that really stand outside of the consensus policy making.
The biggest concern from an Indian perspective is China and what's going down in China at this moment. There are so many reports about the number of COVID cases, the number of deaths as a consequence of COVID. There's also talk about the Chinese economy bouncing back and whether she's being moderated by domestic trouble. What's your reading of what's going down in China?
Well, there's no question. They've gone from zero COVID to everyone gets COVID in weeks, and they weren't ready for it. They didn't have therapeutics for people to take. They no longer were monitoring the numbers of cases that they were getting or the new variants that are showing up. And so for the rest of the world, China, for the second time as the epicenter of the global pandemic, just as they were in 2020 before they told anyone that they had human-to-human transmission, of course, that creates a lot of anxiety about the rest of the world and has led many other countries to say, okay, we're not going to let you travel unless you're testing and all the rest. But more broadly speaking, we do have to recognize that this was a decision taken by one individual leader, right? And he can do that in ways that are positive for the Chinese economy and positive for Chinese technology, but he could just as easily do that in ways that are negative. So it's the very fact that after his third term, suddenly everyone in the Chinese leadership system is loyal to Xi, accounts to Xi. He's not getting contrary. 10 years ago, China was still a dictatorship, but it was a dictatorship by consensus, where you had hardliners and you had more pragmatic technocrats on every issue, and they would be internally squabbling that would eventually come to a strategic long-term consensus. And we've been talking about how China, does policy for the long term, is, really considering what's going to matter on the global stage as it increases in power. You can't say that to the same degree when Xi Jinping has become a second Mao. That's just much harder to do.
Let's talk about Taiwan for a moment. Yeah. There was one stream of global thought which suggested that after she's re-elected, the chances of the PLA making a move on Taiwan increases. The other sense is because their economy has taken a bit of a hit, it's been pushed out into the future by an indefinite number of years. How do you read Xi's mind on the question of Taiwan?
Xi Jinping clearly believes that Taiwan eventually must be integrated into China, but eventually is a long, long time away for a leader that is now president for life. If I think about Taiwan in the near term, the Western reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine showed extraordinary unity. The Chinese have watched that. Showed extraordinary military capability. The Chinese have watched that. They understand that an amphibious assault across a 100-mile strait is a much more challenging thing to do than what the Russians are doing in Ukraine and losing. So it makes them sharpen their pencils militarily. Also, American export controls on semiconductors have helped make TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor company, the strategically most important company in the entire world for the U.S. and for China. And China knows they can't risk that, especially when they're behind the United States and the West more broadly on semiconductors. So, I mean, I'm worried about confrontation over Taiwan in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. Maybe I'm even worried about what happens with Taiwan's elections in 2024 if the DPP decides to run a more independence-minded candidate and they win. But for the near term, this frankly is not an area that I'm very concerned about.
Because they've allowed COVID to spread through their country, the Chinese economy is bouncing back, or it
That's
seems
right.
from the outside. But many say that this is just short term. Long term, China will no longer be able to grow at the speed at which it did. And because the economy and society is aging, China may never actually be able to overtake the United States.
It's not just aging. The population is also shrinking. It hit maximum levels 2 years ago now. And the momentum behind that contraction is only going to grow. Chinese indebtedness and bad debt in their corporate sector is massive. Difficulties in real estate, which is a bubble, but they're only continuing to kick that down the road. They haven't addressed it, as well as the hangover from COVID, supply chain challenges, and a level of decoupling where, big U.S. corporations like Apple increasingly investing in India, in Vietnam, and other countries. This isn't because the American government is telling Apple you have to leave China. It's because Apple itself is concerned that their footprint in China is too large, too uncertain, too risky for their future. So, look, I still would make a bet that China will eventually become the largest economy in the world, but it's not guaranteed. And not only is it not guaranteed, but as I think over the coming decades, the idea that there's going to be a China century is absurd, right? Because it will be a much more multipolar world. China's long-term future, given all the challenges we just discussed, is going to be much more economically constrained.
Let's spend a moment on the Russia-Ukraine war and where you see this go. Because when we were here at the World Economic Forum last, there was a sense that it may go on and drag on, and that's exactly what's happened. Do you see this go on till the next WEF and even further, or do you see some way in which Putin finds a way of getting off the ramp?
Well, I mean, first of all, the WEF is not the principal sort of flagpole for me in terms of how far the Russia-Ukraine war is going. Also, one of the reasons why I said the war was going to continue is because it wasn't just a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and NATO. Now, it's being fought in Ukraine, but it's a proxy war. NATO is providing the intelligence, the training, the military equipment. And every day we see more announcements of military support that even 3-6 months ago, Western allies would have said, we'll never give that to Ukraine because it's too dangerous. And now suddenly it isn't. Why is that? Well, because the stakes are growing, because NATO's more consolidated, Ukraine continues to fight, and the Russians continue to provide war crimes every day, thousands against the Ukrainian people. So the problem we have is that Russia has become the most powerful rogue state in history. And this decoupling of Russia, complete decoupling from the WEF, there are none of them here, from the G7, from Europe, that means that there's no way for Russia to get back. They can't rebuild their gas pipelines to Europe. The Europeans have moved on. They can't get their oligarchs accepted into Western society. They can't unfreeze their central bank assets in the EU, in the United States, in Japan. And so Putin, as long as he's in power, is going to see himself as a fundamental enemy to the West. And that means that the fight is not just going to be about Ukraine. Cyber attacks, fiber, pipeline, proxy efforts, terrorism, espionage, disinformation. I mean, if you're sitting here in Europe, you're at war with Russia. And frankly, that's their deepest concern right now, is what does that mean for their economic development now that the peace dividend that we've experienced in Europe for 30 years is permanently gone?
So we're seeing Iran arm Russia with drones. We're seeing NATO countries give tanks to Ukraine to help them fight back. How long does this war go on in this fashion? Do you see an end? Is it at all possible to guess wisely?
Well, first of all, the war in Ukraine has been going on not just for 10 months, but for 9 years, since 2014. So let's be clear. The United States, the Europeans weren't involved in it. The Ukrainians have been fighting it every day. So they certainly, the Russian appetite to fight in Ukraine shouldn't be measured in months. It's measured in generations, frankly. First of all. Second of all, I can see over the coming months that we might achieve a stalemate on the ground in Ukraine, where the Russians can't make up any territory on the ground, but the Ukrainians increasingly are stuck because the Russians are dug in and have better defenses. But that's not an end to the war. We've already seen that when the Russians get stuck on the ground and pushed back, what are they doing? Every day, every week, they're attacking critical infrastructure. They just blew up an apartment building in Dnipro, and dozens of Ukrainian civilians were killed. This war is not going to be over.
Zelensky seems to think he can win. Can he?
Ukraine is now been invited to become a full member of the European Union. Ukraine has become one of the most powerful militaries on the European continent. Ukraine has captured the imagination of the West and is driving NATO closer together, the G7. So in those very real ways, the Ukrainians have already won. But 44 million Ukrainians have had their lives destroyed. This will be the most tragic geopolitical event of their lives, for their entire lives going forward. 8 million refugees, over 100,000 casualties on the Ukrainian side. Those numbers are only going up. And so, I mean, what's really sad is that the West ignoring this issue, the G0 world that we've had now for almost a decade, well, the Ukrainians are paying the ultimate price for that. And we in the West have to appreciate that it is the Ukrainians that are suffering because we have abdicated leadership for so long. We've allowed Putin to believe that he would be ignored as he kept taking larger and larger chunks of the country.
In your estimate, is Putin as much in control as he has been in the past, or is his control over the Russian state a little weaker now because he hasn't been able to win militarily?
I don't see it. I mean, Russia's economy has contracted by 3.54% in the first year. Ukraine's economy has contracted by 40% in the first year. You don't see the demonstrations on the ground in Russia. They had a few for a few weeks after they called up 300,000 reservists. That was it, right? The special recruitment. The amount of state propaganda, the complete control of the media. Russia's not, it's not the United States, it's not India, it's not a democracy. Putin has an iron fist. And there is really no credible challenge to Putin in the near term. We've seen about 20 mid-level oligarchs commit suicide by jumping out of windows over the last year. If you're in Russia, you know what it means to go against Putin. And not many people are willing to have the courage to do that.
You have a big report in India coming out soon. Give me a sense of where you're sitting at the Eurasia Group, your reading of the India story.
Well, at a time that the emerging markets are taking a real hit because of climate change and supply chain challenges and the war and everything, the pandemic, and at a time when democracies, the big word has been democracies are moving backwards. They're all under siege. India is one country where the sitting leader is consistently over 60%. He's much more popular than his party, and that has allowed him to drive a number of legislative victories over the course of his first couple terms. And it also means that as we look forward, there's very little challenge to him in the country. There's no democracy that has more consolidated leadership today in the world than India. Mexico under AMLO is probably number 2, but constitutionally, AMLO can only have one term.
Okay, so in terms of India's position in the world, just because the fact that Europe is contracting, the fact that the Indian population is what it is and the country continues to grow at a time of global distress, India could be number 3 in terms of the global economy stacks by the end of the decade. But does that also, in some sense, to your mind, signal the rise of India as a nation?
I mean, India, of course, is always going to be careful about the position it plays geopolitically because they have so many different and competing interests at play. I think that on the one hand, India has become much more exciting because after decades of not investing in hard infrastructure, they are seriously investing in digital infrastructure. And technology companies around the world have noticed, and you're seeing a lot more foreign direct investment as a consequence of that. That is a big generational story for India, a country whose demographics are expanding as China's are actually decreasing, and it really does allow you to unlock human capital. But the other thing I would say is that India, as a poor country still per capita, and India with a leader that comes from an undercaste, and represents the 50% of the Indian population that is itself underprivileged, there's only so much of an alliance that you can build with the United States. In the same way that the Biden administration says they've created a floor under the U.S.-China relationship, it can't go any worse. I think the Indians have a ceiling for the U.S.-India relationship, that it can't become a full alliance because India will still in many ways see itself as the leader of the developing world on climate, on inequality, on responding to the pandemic, on all of these issues where the wealthy countries have forgotten about the global South. And India hasn't forgotten about the global South. So I think it's a complicated picture, but ultimately it's so much more of an optimistic picture than we've ever been able to see for India over decades and decades.
In the United States, it seems increasingly clear that President Biden will seek re-election. In your view, is that a good idea? Is it now increasingly certain that Donald Trump might not come back? How do you see this play out, and what do you see happening in the United States?
I think Biden has decided that he is going to run for a second term, even though he's already 80 years old. He had been getting a lot of internal pushback, but with the legislative successes that he's experienced in the past months, that noise has gone down. And also his popularity for the first time since he's become president is higher than his unpopularity. And in the United States, so divided, that's quite unusual. So there's a pretty clear pathway for him to run. And if he runs, no one serious is going to run against him. There might be some challenges, but nothing serious. Trump, of course, announced immediately that he is running, but his popularity has decreased. Never say never. He still has a pathway to the nomination on the Republican side, but there are many people that are running, many of whom have serious name brand recognition across the country, many governors, many senators, many others, including members of his own cabinet, like Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, who I expect will come in. It's going to be a challenge for Trump to get the nomination. Trump has now lost 3 elections in a row for his party. The midterms when he was president, the 2020 election he denies, and then the 2022 midterms just now. He lost to Republicans, 3-time loser. The Republicans are sick of that. And so if Trump doesn't get the nomination and a new Republican wins in 2024 with the Senate and the House, we'll finally see the end of Trump in the United States. And I think a lot of American allies around the world will have an enormous breath of relief because he's been such a bomb in the partisanship of a dysfunctional and divided U.S. political system.
Finally, Gideon Ruckman had a piece out recently where he says Biden could go down in history as one of the best American presidents ever. I mean, his general image outside isn't quite as charismatic as, say, a Kennedy or an Obama, but just given his legislative success and the fact that he helped his party in the midterms, where do you think he stacks at this moment in the annals of American history?
Presidents' legacies are never really appreciated at the time that they're governing. The big challenge that Biden has is he governs America when the country is so incredibly divided. And so domestically, he's never going to be at 60%. If you had, God forbid, if you had a 9/11 moment, you remember when Bush, after 9/11, he had 90% approval in the United States. Americans of all forms just came together. If you had something like that today in the United States, I never want to see that. But the country would be fighting each other over it. The one thing you can say is that on big national security issues like Russia, like China, like Iran, like North Korea, even though the country is really divided and dysfunctional, the policymakers actually agree on what to do. That's why you have a consensus semiconductor policy. It's why the U.S. is leading the world on Ukraine and military support. Biden has helped with that because on foreign policy, Biden doesn't try to divide. He is trying to be a consensus candidate. That's been helpful.
And I could go on, but you have a packed schedule, so I'll end here. I really enjoyed this conversation. Lots of deep and sharp insights. Thank you very much.
It's always good to see you, man. Successful Davos.
Thank you very much. All the best to you.